everyone, and welcome to Classic Gaming Today, where we take a look at the gaming experiences of the past through the eyes of the present. I'm your host, Tony, and today we're going to look at Castlevania, Symphony of the Night, an action role-playing title developed and published by Konami for the Sony PlayStation in 1997, followed by a port to the Sega Saturn in Japan in 1998, as well as a number of re-releases to more modern platforms in later years, including the Xbox 360, Sony PS4 and PSP, and iOS and Android mobile devices. We're going to talk about that game in just a couple minutes, but first, as is usual, just a little bit of housekeeping up front. This is episode number 137. I am excited to be here. I hope all of you are as well. If you'd like to reach out, let me know how I'm doing, provide feedback, comments, suggestions, or just talk about classic games and technology in general. I would love to hear from you, and there are a few ways you can reach out. I have an X account with the handle @ClassicGamingT. I have an email address, which is classicgamingtoday@gmail.com, and we have our Discord server. The link is in the show notes. Discord is the best way to get in touch with me and the rest of the community around this podcast. We have a ton of fun out on Discord. We do weekly and monthly gaming challenges, prizes, awards, discussions. It is all out there. I highly encourage you all to check it out. I also highly encourage you to check out our Patreon. It is patreon.com/classicgamingtoday. If you want even more Classic Gaming Today goodness, including a Patreon exclusive bi-weekly podcast expansion pack, patreon.com/classicgamingtoday is where it's at. I'd also like to give a shout out to our Pantheon patrons. They are ISO, Rich Senewal, David Morton, Sam Twardowski, Sean Oliver, and Maximus Marshall, Steve Novoselic, Wendell Jr., Chris Snowden, Left-Handed Guitarist, The Bay 101, and Marek. Thank you guys for supporting the show. Thank you all for supporting the show. Whether you contribute monetarily or simply listen on a regular basis, I truly do appreciate all of the support. For anyone who may be new, welcome. I'd like to take a brief moment to go over the anatomy of an episode because, for the most part, all of our episodes follow a very similar format and structure. We will always start by talking about the history of the game in question, the historical context, how was the game made, why was the game made, and then we move into a pseudo-review kind of section. And I say pseudo-review because it's not like we assign a numerical ranking or star counts or anything like that, but we do talk about every single game from several different perspectives. We take a look at the graphics. How does the game look? The sound and music. How does the game sound? The narrative and/or story, if the game has one. Playability and controls, and overall feel. What does it feel like to play the game today versus when it was released 20, 30, maybe even 40 plus years ago? We do all of that to reach a verdict as far as how well the game holds up today. And to do that, we assign each game to one of several categories. At the very top of our list is the Pantheon of Classic Gaming. If a game reaches the Pantheon, you know it is that darn good. It is a certifiable classic. You should go out of your way to play those games today. Just beyond the Pantheon are our golden oldies. These are still really good games. I still highly recommend you play them, especially if you enjoy the genre in which the game exists. You should have a good time. They're not quite Pantheon level, but they're still really worthwhile experiences, and I still highly encourage you all to play them today. Beyond the golden oldies, we reach our mediocre mentions. This is where we start getting into the realm of games that I cannot recommend to the broad game-playing population. They might have aged a little bit, might have had a couple of issues to begin with. You may still have a good time, especially if you enjoy the genre in which the game lives. By all means, give it a go, but I can't recommend these games to the broader population. And then beyond the mediocre mentions, we reach the footnotes. These are the games that are best left in the annals of history. I have played them, so you don't have to. I cannot recommend anyone play these titles today. They have either aged incredibly poorly or they may not have been all that great to begin with. With that out of the way, we're going to start talking about the game of the day. That is Castlevania, Symphony of the Night. Castlevania Symphony of the Night is an action role-playing title, developed and published by Konami for the Sony PlayStation in 1997, with a port to the Sega Saturn in Japan in 1998, and a number of re-releases to more modern platforms following in later years. Before we can talk about Symphony of the Night, we need to take a step back to look at the evolution of the Castlevania series overall, a collection of games that in its early years was fairly experimental, despite the fact that nowadays you pretty much know exactly what you're going to get when you buy a Castlevania game. That wasn't quite the case in the early days of the Castlevania series, and as we'll see, it was this focus on experimentation and delivering experiences that didn't always adhere to a common formula that would eventually lead to the creation of our game of the day, Symphony of the Night. The very first Castlevania game was conceptualized by a man named Hitoshi Akamatsu back in 1986, as a sort of homage to the classic Universal Pictures creature features of the 1930s and 1940s, a style of film that Akamatsu had enjoyed throughout his life. Those films would each focus on different monsters and creatures from classic literature and folklore, like the vampire Count Dracula, mummies from ancient Egypt, the unseen, though still scary, Invisible Man, and the amalgamation of human body parts known as Dr. Frankenstein's monster. Across all of these films, various monstrosities would be brought to life on the silver screen, and fans of this new, for the time, style of horror film would have their imaginations captured, and their bravery tested. Akamatsu had always been a fan of these classic films, so when Konami leadership came to him with an assignment to direct a new action platformer title for Nintendo's 8-bit console family, it didn't take long for Akamatsu to decide to create a brand new cinematic horror-themed game, complete with a variety of both classic and newly imagined monsters for players to combat. As a lover of all cinema, Akamatsu would take inspiration from both Universal Pictures creature features as well as some more recent cinema classics, with perhaps the most prominent inspiration from then modern film being the fact that lead character Simon Belmont's iconic whip was chosen in large part because Akamatsu was a huge fan of Indiana Jones' first adventure, The Raiders of the Lost Ark. As Akamatsu and the rest of the team continued to work on that very first Castlevania title, it was becoming evident that the game was on its way to becoming a hit, and the joy with which Akamatsu injected various cinematic motifs, inspirations, and other self-imagined creations into the game was infectious. So much so that the whole team would dedicate themselves to creating the best game they could possibly make. Which is why, when Castlevania debuted on the Famicom Disk System in Japan in September of 1986, followed by a North American release on the Nintendo Entertainment System 6 months later, it would capture the hearts and minds of gamers around the world, many of whom had some familiarity with the classic creatures that made up the game's world, but had never played a game that allowed them an opportunity to battle those creatures directly. Castlevania would become a hit shortly after its release, and even today, it remains on many gamers' best games of all time lists, a truly landmark release in video game history. As you might expect, when a company releases a critical and commercial hit title, sequels will often follow, and in the case of Castlevania, that's exactly what would end up happening, as Castlevania would not only be ported to a number of different console and computer platforms, but would also inspire a number of spin-off efforts, as well as a direct sequel, which is what drove the creation of the title that would come to be known as Castlevania II: Simon's Quest in 1987. Akamatsu returned to direct the second entry in the Castlevania series, and given the success of the first title, it stands to reason that the game's development team could have simply designed a number of new levels, added in some new monsters, and stuck to the original game's formula, which in all likelihood would have given gamers exactly what they were clamoring for, which was more Castlevania. Only here, Akamatsu and the team would take a somewhat different approach. Rather than copy the formula and structure from the first Castlevania title, the team behind Castlevania II would instead implement a number of different gameplay tweaks to make the game more of an action/role-playing kind of experience, with the opportunity to gain experience and improve the power of your character as you played the game. Non-linear exploration that didn't require you to go through a set of levels, but would instead allow you to navigate a pseudo-open world as you saw fit. A fully realized day-night cycle that would affect the power of enemies you might encounter, towns where you could talk to non-player characters and purchase new items and equipment, and the inclusion of even more attack types that serve to make combat more engaging than the original game's more limited combat options. Taking a look at the more open-ended nature of Castlevania 2, the astute amongst you might assume that Castlevania 2's design shift was inspired, at least in part, by Nintendo's incredibly popular and influential 1986 title Metroid, a game where, similar to Castlevania 2, you'd traverse a fairly open environment, gather different items to progress further in your adventure, and power up your character through acquiring different upgrades. Only here, you'd actually be wrong, as according to Akamatsu, Metroid did not play any role in Castlevania 2's departure from the original's framework. Though, interestingly, a different title entirely would, in fact, be responsible for the game's different take on the Castlevania formula. That game would be The Maze of Gallius, another Konami-developed game that was released in 1987 for the Japanese-based MSX computer platform. The Maze of Gallius would task players with controlling two different characters, each with unique abilities, in a quest to explore various locations, defeat the enemies and bosses that inhabited those locations, and collect a number of different power-ups and items, many of which would allow players to explore otherwise blocked-off sections of the game world within a given location. Akamatsu had been familiar with The Maze of Gallius, and thought that these somewhat novel gameplay mechanics would be a perfect match for the expanded gameplay he had envisioned for his Castlevania sequel. With that inspiration in mind, Akamatsu and the team would create Castlevania 2 to be a somewhat familiar, but still decidedly different experience than the original title, and in the process, would create another classic 8-bit title that would, similar to the first Castlevania, be both critically and commercially successful, with many critics praising the game's more open-ended gameplay, longer playtime, and RPG elements, all aspects of the game that would end up being influential for future releases, eventually. And I say eventually because, as Konami and Akamatsu moved on from Castlevania 2 to the third mainline installment in the series, most of the RPG-like elements introduced with Simon's Quest would be entirely scrapped for Castlevania 3: Dracula's Curse. In fact, Castlevania 3 would be much more reminiscent of the first Castlevania title, with a stage-based progression system and more focus on action and platforming over its immediate predecessor. Now, that's not to say that Dracula's Curse was a simple reset back to Castlevania's roots, as Castlevania 3 would include a number of tweaks to that gameplay formula that clearly demonstrated an evolution beyond the original game. These included the inclusion of multiple playable characters, each of whom had their own unique abilities, and a branching narrative of sorts, where at certain points in the game, players would be provided with an option as to which stage to tackle next, a design decision that allowed for increased playability and a degree of player choice leading to multiple endings, which was still a rarity at this point in video game history. Those new gameplay mechanics, coupled with the return to the series' roots, would end up being a powerful combination for critics and players alike, many of whom praised the fact that Castlevania 3 was like the original, but with a more refined and expansive design, making Castlevania 3, in the eyes of many, the definitive NES Castlevania experience. As the 90s approached, however, new technology was on the horizon, with 16-bit consoles beginning to release on the market, each of which had far more advanced graphical and audio capabilities than their 8-bit ancestors, which allowed for more impressive visuals, more realistic, albeit still synthesized, soundtracks, and even greater gameplay possibilities, driven not just by the power of the underlying hardware, but also the fact that these newer consoles often had controllers with additional button inputs, making it so that games could implement even more complex control schemes, leading to, hopefully, more engaging gameplay. Prior to 16-bit consoles becoming prevalent, the Castlevania series had made quite the name for itself across its various 8-bit incarnations, and it's not hard to imagine that Konami would want to continue that forward momentum on the new 16-bit consoles that gamers now had access to. Which is why, in 1991, Konami would release Super Castlevania 4, their first Castlevania game to appear on the Super Nintendo, and the fourth mainline entry in the series. Super Castlevania 4 would be the first Castlevania title that Akamatsu wasn't involved with, but luckily for all involved, the game was still in good hands, as veteran Konami game designer and director Masahiro Ueno would be handed the reins for this particular iteration of the Castlevania series, and Ueno, despite not having worked on a Castlevania title previously, had a profound and deep respect for the series, with a particular fondness for the very first Castlevania title developed back in 1986. When Ueno was asked to lead the development of Super Castlevania 4, He knew he wanted the game to represent the best possible version of that style of game, meaning that the majority of the experimentation that Akamatsu and the team had been playing around with over the last 2 entries, things like multiple characters, branching progression, RPG elements, and non-linear exploration, would all be eliminated for Super Castlevania 4, with a much more linear experience with a concrete set of stages to play through in order to make your way from the beginning of the game to the final boss encounter. In fact, in many ways, Super Castlevania 4 is almost like a remake of the original Castlevania, though Ueno is quick to point out that this is only a partial remake, as a number of gameplay mechanics would be much refined beyond the original game. Super Castlevania 4 wasn't just a fresh coat of paint on top of the original Castlevania title. It was a truly original experience, albeit with a number of similar but refined mechanics to best take advantage of the 16-bit power of the Super Nintendo Entertainment System. The only question was, would players and critics appreciate a return to a simpler game framework, albeit one that was polished to a ridiculous shine? The short answer to that question is yes, they would, as Super Castlevania 4 would be praised as being one of the best Castlevania games ever created, and even further, is still recognized even today as being one of the best games of all time. Critics and players alike declare the game to be a nearly perfect refinement of the traditional Castlevania formula, and despite how well received each prior installment of the series had been, in the eyes of many, Super Castlevania 4 was, quite simply, the best the series had ever been. Interestingly, as work on Super Castlevania 4 for the Super NES was underway, another unrelated Castlevania effort was beginning to be worked on in Japan, this one under the direction of a man named Toru Hagihara. Hagihara had joined Konami back in 1987, and interestingly, his very first assignment upon joining the team was to help develop the code needed to bring Castlevania II: Simon's Quest to life, a title that Hagihara had always held in high regard, both because he enjoyed the non-linear RPG-like gameplay that the game utilized, but also because, as his first game, it would always hold a special place in his heart, as most firsts often do. Hagihara had progressed in his career from that early starting point, eventually evolving from programming-centric roles into more of a focus on game design, and eventually becoming a game director, which effectively meant he would be the main person responsible for the success, or failure, of the various games he would be tasked with creating. While other teams at Konami focused their efforts on consoles like the Super Nintendo and Sega Genesis, Hagihara would be tasked with bringing a new Castlevania experience to life on NEC's PC Engine console, which was known as the TurboGrafx-16 in North America. For those of us outside of Japan, focusing on the PC Engine might sound like a bit of an odd choice for any company hoping to sell their games at any order of magnitude, because the PC Engine was not a very popular console across the majority of the world. The story was very different in Japan, however, where the PC Engine would become insanely popular, with only Nintendo's Super Famicom proving an obstacle to full-scale Japanese market dominance. So, when Konami decided to make a Castlevania game for the PC Engine, and specifically its Super CD-ROM add-on, it only made sense that the title would be designed as a Japan-exclusive release, at least at first, which was the exact direction Hagihara and the team received as they began working on the game that would eventually be known as Castlevania: Rondo of Blood. Beyond enjoying Castlevania 2, Hagihara enjoyed pretty much every Castlevania title that had released up to this point in history, with Rondo of Blood representing the 10th overall entry in the series, if you include mainline entries and related side story titles. And with Rondo of Blood, Hagihara was determined to deliver an experience that gamers would enjoy, as well as an experience that would inherit a variety of features that had been prevalent in prior Castlevania titles. The core of the game would be fairly linear, with a set series of stages to progress through, but Hagihara would augment that linearity with a number of different branches through various levels, where depending on an individual player's choice, he or she may end up facing different enemies and bosses, and may even end up exploring different locations, adding a degree of replayability and open-endedness that the most linear entries in the Castlevania series simply didn't have. Further driving the feeling of exploration was the fact that Rondo of Blood would be designed to not utilize an in-game timer, meaning that players were able to spend as much time exploring an individual level as they wanted, a feature that, at least in mainline Castlevania entries, had only been seen in Hagihara's earlier work, the decidedly non-linear Castlevania 2. Hagihara would also end up taking some inspiration from Castlevania 3's multiple character setup, where at a certain point in Rondo of Blood, you'd be able to save an individual who could afterwards become a fully playable character, complete with new skills and capabilities that would further increase the breadth of gameplay available to players. Effectively, Hagihara was attempting to create a Castlevania experience that combined what he considered to be the best elements of every prior Castlevania game into a singular experience that would, hopefully, appeal to anyone who sat down to play the game. The good news for Hagihara, and Konami by extension, is that Castlevania Rondo of Blood would prove to be yet another critical and commercial success for the franchise, with many individuals declaring Rondo of Blood to be one of the best Castlevania titles ever created, as well as being one of the best side-scrolling action platform titles ever released. While the debate as to whether Rondo of Blood or Super Castlevania 4 represents the best of the best in Castlevania gaming at this point in history still rages on, the simple fact is that both titles are worthy of recognition, and Rondo of Blood in particular would prove so popular in Japan that it would eventually be ported to the Super Nintendo and re-released as Castlevania Dracula X in North America, providing non-Japanese gamers a chance to experience what had, up to that point, been a Japanese exclusive title on a console that not many people in America owned. And in the process, the Castlevania series would receive even greater acclaim and continue to build its fan base, literally across the entire world. Interestingly, as Rondo of Blood was nearing its release in Japan, yet another Castlevania title would enter active development, that being a forthcoming release for the Sega 32X console add-on. Konami was always interested in using the latest in available technology to deliver new gaming experiences, and with Castlevania being one of their flagship franchises, it only made sense they would attempt to make the leap to a 32-bit platform in order to, hopefully, deliver even more interesting and fun gaming experiences to the masses. There was just one issue with that hope, which was the fact that upon its release, the Sega 32X had a little bit of an identity crisis on its hands. The 32X was not a standalone home console, but was instead an add-on for the Sega Genesis that would ostensibly turn that console from a 16-bit platform into a 32-bit juggernaut. Even more appealing was the fact that if your Genesis was attached to a Sega CD, then even the Sega CD would be able to take advantage of the new 32-bit capabilities of the system. Sega had created a true tower of power, both because of its 32-bit processing capabilities, but also because the 32X literally stacked on top of your pre-existing Sega peripherals to turn your collection of Sega consoles into a veritable monolith in your living room. Unfortunately for all involved, though, the 32X would end up not selling all that well, and Sega would have a challenging time attempting to convince game developers to make titles for the 32X. These issues were mostly driven by the fact that the 32X was viewed as a stopgap in Sega's roadmap, something to tide gamers over until the eventual release of the Sega Saturn, which was all well and good, except for the fact that all of Sega's home console competitors were readying their own next-generation console platform releases, with even new console market entrants, like electronics giant Sony, about to release their PlayStation console, which was purported to be a truly advanced piece of hardware that, more than any currently available console, would represent the first real leap into the next generation of gaming consoles. This competition and perception would be difficult for Sega to overcome, and over time, the 32X would end up declining in popularity fairly quickly, so much so that the add-on would end up only having 40 games released for it, a definite failure for Sega, and one that would demonstrate that even top-tier console makers could, potentially, have a misstep. Konami, for its part, saw the writing on the wall, and it didn't take long before the company decided to cancel their forthcoming Castlevania title for the 32X, leaving the company without a new Castlevania release on the roadmap for the foreseeable future. Sure, the company knew that they wanted to port Rondo of Blood to the Super Nintendo as Castlevania Dracula X, but that wouldn't be a truly new experience. That was effectively a localization of a previously created title, and would be designed for a 16-bit console that, like I just alluded to, was about to be outclassed by forthcoming next-generation systems. Konami knew they needed to make the leap into the next generation of console gaming, and they figured that a new entry in the Castlevania series was going to happen. The only question was, what would that new title be, and on which console would it eventually be made for? As luck would have it, following the release of Rondo of Blood in Japan, Toru Hagihara and his team were available to begin working on their next game. And with the 32X iteration of Castlevania cancelled, the team that had been working on that game were also looking for their next assignment. So Konami decided to task Hagihara and the combined teams from both Rondo of Blood and Castlevania 32X with the creation of another Castlevania title, this one to be designed for Sony's new PlayStation console. The collective efforts of that team and Hagihara's own unique creativity and game design sensibilities are what would eventually result in the creation of the title that most people consider to be one of the best games of all time, Castlevania Symphony of the Night. As Hagihara and the team initially began brainstorming design ideas for this new entry in the Castlevania series, much of the focus was on delivering a familiar, albeit expanded Castlevania experience, designed to take advantage of the advanced capabilities of the Sony PlayStation, but not necessarily a significantly divergent experience from the various Castlevania titles that had preceded it. That direction, however, would all change following a chance encounter at a local video game store, where Hagihara saw firsthand how those past Castlevania titles were being perceived by the game-playing public. Like we've talked about, the Castlevania series has been fairly popular throughout its entire existence, though as time went on, less and less copies of individual titles would be sold, as is fairly common amongst most games and series. As Hagihara was browsing a local video game store, he saw prior Castlevania releases all sitting in the bargain bin just waiting to be purchased, albeit at a steep discount, and he considered, why were these high-quality games being relegated to the same retail space as true shovelware quality releases? What was missing that made these Castlevania entries lose their spark over time? Eventually, Hagihara came to the conclusion that the issue with prior Castlevania titles was the fact that none of them had been particularly expansive, with most focusing on a collection of levels that players would progress through, but none feeling all that much like exploring a sizable and lengthy campaign. And even further, despite various efforts over the years to include non-linear gameplay, or to introduce branching levels and multiple characters to hopefully drive some degree of replayability, the simple fact was that prior Castlevania titles were fairly limited in scope, and outside of the subset of fans who wanted to explore literally every nook and cranny of those prior experiences, most gamers, and even Hagihara himself, found earlier Castlevania entries to be fairly short, one-and-done kinds of experiences. Hagihara decided that this new Castlevania title would address this perceived issue, as he would make every effort to ensure Symphony of the Night was a much deeper, lengthy experience, with the ultimate goal of making a game that players could enjoy for hours upon hours, while still likely not seeing all that the game had to offer. Under this new direction, the game's design would shift dramatically, and what was once looked at as a natural evolution to the fairly traditional Castlevania formula would take on a life of its own. The team behind the game began looking at other games that they believed felt more expansive and rewarded players with meaningful exploration-styled gameplay, settling in on two major influences that they could draw inspiration from: Nintendo's The Legend of Zelda and Metroid series. From The Legend of Zelda, the team would take the concept of an open-world-like environment, which Hagihara would reimagine within the context of typical Castlevania settings, creating a gothic and horror-infused set of locations that would make players feel like they were exploring a ridiculously huge game world, all within the confines of Dracula's castle, which is where Symphony of the Night was intended to take place. To that general open-world structure, the team would take inspiration from the Metroid series, and in particular, Super Metroid, where lead character Samus Aran was tasked with finding a series of different items and upgrades, each of which would enable her to explore new sections of the game world, effectively unlocking more opportunities for exploration as the game played on. In Super Metroid, backtracking with newly discovered items might let you view different locations in an entirely new light, and could potentially open up more of the world to exploration, making it so that even if you've been somewhere before, there is always the chance for new secrets, locations, and upgrades to uncover. Hagihara and the team thought that this combination of influences, along with the Castlevania series' own identity as a gothic horror action series, would prove to be an intoxicating blend of deep and engaging gameplay, and one that would hopefully appeal to gamers around the world. As the team continued to refine the general concepts to be implemented in the game, they decided to include various RPG elements to enhance the gameplay mechanics even further, with player power increasing as experience points were acquired and levels were gained, and player capabilities being augmented through the use of a full inventory and equipment system, complete with power-ups, special skills, upgrades, and a full suite of armaments, each of which would dramatically impact the way players would experience the game's combat. The thought amongst the team was, if they could take those RPG elements, combine them with the game's overall open-world exploration framework, add a ton of secrets and locations that could only be visited once players found the appropriate items or skills, and then marry all of that with top-flight visuals and audio, then there was no chance the game would be anything less than a hit. Rather, the team believed that they might, potentially, create the equivalent of a modern classic. In March of 1997, the team would learn whether all of their efforts were worth it, as Castlevania Symphony of the Night would release on the Sony PlayStation system, representing the first truly new Castlevania release in over 3 years, the biggest gap the series had ever gone between new game releases. The team had poured their heart and soul into the title, and as Symphony of the Night began making the rounds to various critics and gaming publications, Hagihara and the team held their breath. Would Symphony of the Night be a critical success? The short answer to that question is yes it would, as Castlevania Symphony of the Night would be universally acclaimed as being a landmark release in video game history, with almost every single critic praising nearly every aspect of the game, declaring without question that Symphony of the Night was one of the best games of all time, a sentiment that persists amongst the general gaming population even today. Interestingly, however, while the critical response to the title was definitely positive, the commercial performance of the game fell well short of expectations, driven primarily by a lack of advertising that, at least in the short term, impacted sales. So much so that it appeared the game would end up being a dud on the market, despite how good the title seemingly was. Luckily for all involved, though, the level of positive critical response would eventually drive people to buy the game, and as more and more gamers became enraptured by Symphony of the Night's charm, word of mouth began to spread, until finally, the game would begin to sell well enough to be recognized as both a critical and commercial success. It is a bit surprising that a game as universally praised as Castlevania Symphony of the Night could have ever been looked at as anything other than a hit. But the simple truth is that despite how good something may be, there's never a guarantee of commercial success. Regardless, Symphony of the Night would eventually become a hit both critically and commercially, and even beyond its own success, the game would popularize the concept of the Metroidvania, the combination of Metroid and Castlevania features that today represents one of the more successful and beloved genres in all of gaming. While technically Metroidvanias did exist before Symphony of the Night, after the game's release, the genre was effectively institutionalized, and countless future titles would be inspired by and attempt to mimic Symphony of the Night's unique blend of gameplay features. As you might expect, Symphony of the Night would end up inspiring future Castlevania releases as well, though Castlevania as a gaming franchise has fallen a bit under the radar in recent years, with a period of time from 2015 to the present featuring no new releases in the series at all. Though with over 20 million copies of Castlevania titles sold across its lifetime, it remains a successful series, even if the pace of releases has slowed dramatically. Castlevania has remained in the public spotlight, however, as various compilations of prior titles continue to make their way to market, and even more broadly, there are several animated adaptations of the Castlevania universe available on Netflix that have all been well received by both fans of the games, as well as individuals who enjoy well-written, high-quality, adult-focused animated entertainment. Even though Castlevania as a gaming series is not quite as popular as it once was, Castlevania as a franchise continues to be enjoyed by countless individuals even today. Turning our attention to the people that turned Castlevania, and by extension Symphony of the Night, into such a successful series, nearly all of them have moved on to new endeavors, both in the video game industry as well as outside of the public spotlight. While some, like Symphony of the Night creator Toru Hagihara, haven't appreciably worked on a game in almost 20 years, that in no way diminishes the accomplishment of bringing Castlevania, and in particular Symphony of the Night, to life. a collective effort that served to redefine what it meant to be a Castlevania title, while at the same time perfecting the blend of gameplay, exploration, and progression that served as the foundation of the modern Metroidvania gaming genre, an intoxicating combination that remains a potent and addicting brew even today. It is hard to overstate just how influential and important Symphony of the Night is within the context of video and computer game history, and as such, Castlevania Symphony of the Night will likely remain a beloved and cherished title that countless individuals will continue to remember and play for countless years to come. We are now going to shift to start talking about what it feels like to play Castlevania Symphony of the Night today versus when it was released all the way back in 1997. At its core, Castlevania Symphony of the Night is a stereotypical Metroidvania experience, a game full of hidden secrets, non-linear gameplay and exploration, the need to backtrack to previous areas after acquiring new skills or items, an equipment system that serves to enhance your defensive and offensive stats, the ability to gain experience and level up your character, and a number of different creatures and bosses to defeat. Hearing that description, you might think to yourself, yep, that sounds like a pretty standard Metroidvania, and yes, you are 100% right in that assertion. The piece that might be missed in that recognition, though, is the fact that the reason Metroidvanias exist today and have all of these standard features is because Symphony of the Night combined them into a masterpiece of an experience that has resonated with players around the world for the last 28 years. And yes, I know, spoiler alert, but I cannot beat around the bush on this one. Symphony of the Night is an absolute masterpiece of a game. So let's talk about it. If by some chance you haven't played the game before, the core concept is that you control Dracula's son, Alucard, on a quest to infiltrate his father's castle and end his evil reign once and for all. To do that, you'll be required to go through a ridiculously diverse and varied section of themed areas and rooms, like gothic libraries, castle ramparts, mechanical clock towers, underground catacombs, underwater crypts, and spooky attics, just to name a few of the castle sections you'll have the pleasure of exploring throughout your adventure. As you play the game, you'll find more and more areas of the castle to explore, both through beating various bosses as well as finding and using different items that will open up new areas for discovery. Because, as with all Metroidvanias, one of the primary means of game progression is finding new skills and items that unlock different contraptions, or provide a means of movement and traversal to overcome an obstacle that would otherwise be insurmountable. This concept was not new when Symphony of the Night came out, having been pioneered by one half of the Metroidvania namesake, Metroid, all the way back in 1986. In that game, you'd explore the world around you, routinely encountering areas that were either locked, requiring a specific item or key to unlock, or unpassable, requiring a specific item to navigate past. As an example, trying to get to an out-of-the-way ledge might seem impossible with your base skill set. But find a special pair of boots that enables a double jump mechanic, and that ledge is now reachable, as is the entire world beyond that ledge, whatever that may be. In Metroid, unlocking a new section of the world might be met with the acquisition of a new power-up, or the discovery of a new boss, but because of the technology available at the time, the act of discovering the world itself, while still fun, wasn't quite as impactful as it could have been, simply because the world's design and related mechanics were limited to the 8-bit restrictions of the Nintendo Entertainment System. For the time, it was amazing, and being able to navigate from the cool blues of an underground space cave into the interior lava pits of an alien colony after finding a specific progression item was something that many players will never forget, and that general sense of progression and discovery is what has formed the foundation of every single Metroid-inspired title that would follow for the next almost 40 years. I mention this to say that while Metroid may have introduced most of the world to this type of progression, and other titles over the years have mimicked and in some cases improved upon Metroid's design, Symphony of the Night is one of the first titles where the simple act of discovering a new, previously hidden part of the game world is almost as rewarding as the items and power-ups that may be hidden in that new section of the game. The overall game world in Symphony of the Night is designed so well, and with such attention to detail, that the mere act of exploration is a delight, and every time I found a new item that I realized could take me to an unexplored section of the castle, I became incredibly excited, not just because I'd probably find a cool set of equipment to make me even more powerful, but because I was able to discover more of the intricately detailed, impeccably designed environment that truly evoked the sense that I was exploring a supernatural, and at times otherworldly, vampire's castle. Exploration obviously is a core pillar of the game, and one that I constantly enjoyed. But that exploration was made even more meaningful by the fact that I couldn't simply walk everywhere I wanted right out of the gate, a fact that I've mentioned already in relation to the item and skill progression mechanic we just discussed. The thing that makes Symphony of the Night so special, though, is the variety of ways it both gates and allows progression, which goes far beyond most Metroidvanias in terms of depth and breadth. Some of Symphony of the Night's world is blocked off by needing a specific item to progress, very similar to traditional Metroidvania mechanics, but even in that very traditional situation, Symphony of the Night provides a level of depth simply not seen in many games. As an example, let's say you find yourself in a hallway covered by spikes on the floor and ceiling. Well, the only non-deadly way past that area is to find a special armor set that allows you to break those spikes without taking damage, which you can equip and unequip as needed. In other words, rather than having the ability to break spikes become a core part of your skill set, it just so happens that one piece of equipment you'll potentially gain access to has a special ability that will allow you to progress further in one specific section of Dracula's castle. Or you may not find that item at all. It really depends on how thoroughly you explore the world around you. There are a variety of equipment-based effects that you'll find throughout the game, some of which reward you with progression, while others will allow you to more easily defeat certain enemy types, or provide specific buffs, like raising your stats when it's nighttime in-game, while others still might allow you to see things that would otherwise be invisible. The level of variety here is pretty vast, and in some capacity, each piece of equipment that you find will provide some form of progression, whether that's in terms of your overall power, your ability to interact with the world, or by granting an ability to reach a different section of the castle to explore further into the game. And actually, we probably should talk more about the general feeling of power progression as you play the game, specifically as it relates to the game's equipment system. Symphony of the Night uses an RPG-like equipment system where you can find different pieces of equipment for different slots across your body, such as your head, your back, your left and right hand, your chest, your feet, and 2 special slots, which effectively allow you to wear rings, necklaces, and other accessory-type items. Unlike other Castlevania titles released up to this point, your ability to defeat enemies is tied directly to the power level of your equipment, and while player skill certainly plays a big part in how successful you'll ultimately be, your equipment loadout is a key modifier that can make things either easier or more difficult, depending on how many quality pieces of equipment you found. The most notable impact on combat is certainly the power of your equipped weapon, though even here, the game injects a degree of diversity that goes well beyond the base power stats that you might see on a given weapon. As an example, you might find a sword that at first glance appears awesome, with a high damage modifier that far exceeds your current weapon. But when you go to use that weapon, you discover that it swings at half the speed as your current weapon, and depending on your overall gameplay style, you may in fact prefer quicker hitting, albeit lower powered weapons, over slower but higher impact weaponry. This is largely a personal preference kind of thing, and I myself tried a variety of different weapons throughout my playthrough, from very short range, quick hitting fist-based weapons to very large two-handed swords that cleaved common enemies in two in a single swing. At the end of the day, every single weapon is completely viable to play the game with, which is a testament to the quality of the game's overall design, as there wasn't a single weapon I used that I felt was underpowered. There was, however, one very late game sword that is undeniably overpowered, and if you happen to find that particular rare sword, I can guarantee you that you'll feel like the most powerful being in the world for the rest of the game. No spoilers here, because you all know I try to avoid them whenever possible. But if anyone is interested in becoming a Blender of Death, let me know and I will clue you in to how to get the objectively best weapon in the game. Anyway, the general sense of power progression driven by the game's equipment system is incredibly smooth, and every time you find an upgrade, you'll feel like you got an upgrade, which is something that sounds like an odd thing to celebrate, but in reality, there are so many games where upgrades give you an improvement to your stats without really having a direct impact on your gameplay. Upgrades in Symphony of the Night directly improve your character, and as a result, it's always exciting to find a new item or weapon, because you can almost guarantee that it's going to be something worthwhile that will make you feel stronger than you were before. Oh, and I should mention that the game uses the somewhat cliched setup of showing you at near full power at the very beginning of the game, before stripping you of your power and forcing you to reacquire all of your equipment and skills as you play through the rest of the game. From my perspective, this served a critical purpose, in that it showed you just how powerful you could potentially be, and let me tell you, after losing that power, you will desperately want it back. From a psychological standpoint, this was a major driving factor in making me want to gather more equipment and become more powerful, as the game showed me my potential right at the beginning of the game, before plunging me back to schlub status 10 minutes after starting the game. Regaining my power over the course of the game could have been tedious, but instead, it was ultimately insanely enjoyable, a direct result of the smooth and intuitive power progression curve that the game's designers built into the game. Beyond equipment-based progression, there's also a separate set of toggleable abilities called relics that provide additional exploration and power-based progression mechanics. These relics oftentimes dramatically change the way you play the game, opening up new gameplay possibilities that you didn't even know were possible before, and similar to the equipment system, the amount of variety here is pretty incredible. And in fact, some relics are even required for you to get access to staple game features that are otherwise handed to you in other Castlevania titles. As an example, in the Castlevania series, hitting a candle will oftentimes reward you with either a secondary weapon or some other resource like consumable hearts. Well, in Symphony of the Night, you might be taken aback the first time you hit one of these candles because you'll notice that nothing actually happens. No items drop, no hearts flutter to the ground, the candle simply vanishes. The reason for that is that you need to find a special relic that allows you to see otherwise unseen items. And once you get that relic and toggle it on, you'll now be able to see the items that you assumed would be dropping the whole time. Some people might think that hiding a core mechanic of prior Castlevania titles behind the discovery of a relic could potentially be a poor design decision, but I personally think it's brilliant for a couple of different reasons. For one, the required relic is pretty easy to find in the very early stages of the game, so it's not like you're going to be without the ability to pick up secondary items for long. But second, and perhaps most important, is that this particular relic acts almost like a tutorial for the rest of the relics in the game. Meaning, it teaches players, without a bunch of tooltips or pop-ups, that relics can dramatically alter the way you play the game. And once a player learns that lesson, you better believe every single relic you discover will be met with a sense of anticipation, because who the heck knows what new mechanic will be enabled after you pick that relic up. I did find it interesting that each relic could be toggled on or off, because from my perspective, I don't see why anyone would ever want any relic to be disabled, as it's not like any of them come with a downside or negative impact to your abilities. Every relic builds your power, or your ability to explore, so the fact that they can be toggled off is a bit of an odd inclusion to me. I'm curious if anyone knows of a reason why you would want to disable a specific relic, because I can't think of one. If you do know of a reason though, definitely let me know. Anyway, there are a ton of relics in the game, some of which allow you to progress to new sections of the castle, similar to equipment items we spoke about previously, while others not only reward progression, but also introduce brand new gameplay mechanics that you'll end up using at various points throughout your adventure, with perhaps the most impactful relics you'll find being 3 different shape-shifting abilities that turn you literally into different creatures, all of whom have unique abilities to learn and utilize. Over the course of the game, you'll be able to turn yourself into a wolf, a mist cloud, and a bat. And as you might imagine, each of those abilities serve very specific purposes at certain points in the game. As an example, as a bat, you can fly into the air and reach areas of the map that would otherwise be out of reach, an incredibly useful skill in its own right, but also fairly limited, as you have no way to attack airborne enemies, and if you get struck by one of those enemies, you'll turn back into Alucard and unceremoniously fall to the ground. Over the course of the game, though, you'll find additional relics that augment your bat's skill set, including the ability to throw fireballs at enemies, in addition to a sonar ability that can help you see in the dark, before eventually being further upgraded into a pretty awesome area effect damage skill. The Wolf and Mist forms also receive similar upgrades over the course of the game, which serves to turn each shape-shifting ability from something only used for environmental exploration into more of a standard tool in your toolbox, where you may decide to use a certain shapeshift ability to deal with specific enemies simply because it's easier to do so using that form as opposed to Alucard directly. From my perspective, the best and most useful shapeshifting ability in the game is the Bat, at least once you find all of its skill upgrades. Flying around and attacking tons of enemies at the same time with sonar-powered blasts never gets old, and while none of the shapeshift forms are as powerful as Alucard himself, it's still a lot of fun to play around with these alternative gameplay styles, and like I mentioned, in some situations, shapeshifted forms are actually better to use than Alucard's base skill set. Beyond equipment and relics, there's also a collection of familiars you can acquire throughout your playthrough, each of which have their own specific skills that may, or may not, be useful to you based on your gameplay style. Some familiars, like the Fairy, serve a purely support role, with automatic heal item usage whenever your life drops too low, while other familiars, like the Sword, are purely offensive, and will attack any enemies on the screen in an attempt to help you on your quest. Each familiar levels up and gains additional power the more you use them, and assuming you find a favorite familiar and stick with it, you'll likely have a pretty powerful companion by the time you reach the end of the game. I don't know that any familiar is powerful enough to dramatically impact your playthrough, but as a nice little bonus, there's a lot to like with the familiar system. There's also a whole spell system built into the game, in which various spells can be cast by pressing a combination of direction and button inputs, but honestly, this one was designed a bit too obscurely for me. Unlike the relic, equipment, and skill system where you acquire actual items or representations of items in the game world, spells don't appear to be acquired in the same way. Instead, from my understanding, you learn spells simply by using them, which means you need to discover what the right combination of button inputs is for any given spell, after which it'll add the spell to your spell list. During the course of my 10-ish hour playthrough, I randomly learned one spell, and even then, I never felt a need to use it. I love the fact that spells are included in the game, and I appreciate the concept of needing to discover how to cast the spell before you can actually cast it. But I feel like this is one aspect of the game that was a bit half-baked, especially when compared to every other aspect of the game's design. This just felt like something the team decided was good enough rather than something that they truly polished. It's not enough to detract from the quality of the rest of the game, but it does stick out like a sore thumb because of the quality of the rest of the game. And speaking of that quality, holy cow, is Symphony of the Night a masterpiece of a title. All of the stuff we've talked about so far combines together into an experience that is incredibly memorable, infinitely playable, and timelessly modern, despite being made almost 30 years ago. And that's not even mentioning other aspects of the game that contribute to its overall quality, like the huge numbers of monsters and bosses, each of which have unique mechanics to deal with, the diversity of the game world, the mostly hidden second half of the game, which when I first encountered it as a kid was literally a jaw-dropping moment. All of that, and more, is what makes Castlevania Symphony of the Night one of the best games of all time. We're going to talk more about why Symphony of the Night is one of the best games of all time in just a couple minutes. But first, as we always do, we need to take a look at the back of the box, because, as you all know, I love looking at the back of the box for these games. I love learning how different companies marketed their titles, especially in the era of gaming that we typically look at. Back then, we didn't have a pervasive internet. We didn't have YouTube with gameplay videos that we could look up. Back then, when we made a buying decision, it was based on word of mouth from family and friends, reviews we might have read in magazines, and what the box actually looked like. Did the front of the box make the game look cool? If so, we'd pick it up. Did the back of the box make the game sound cool? If so, we might purchase it. If not, back on the shelf it would go. So, for Castlevania Symphony of the Night for the Sony PlayStation console, the back of the box says, "The Legacy of Evil returns. As a descendant of Dracula, you must end the vampire bloodline. Can you rid the world of this unspeakable terror? Uncover the mystery of Castlevania and challenge an adventure as legendary as its name. Over 140 different enemies, bosses, and ghastly creatures. Awesome magical spells. Transform into a bat, a wolf, or ethereal mist. Hidden weapons, secrets, and characters. The largest Castlevania ever." And then there are some quotes from different magazines. One from EGM in November of 1996. "Mind-blowing 32-bit special effects. This is Konami at their best." Then there's one from GamePro, May of 1997. "Castlevania is a blast. The soundtrack resounds with synthesized and orchestrated music." And then finally, GameFan from April of 1997. "A huge game. If you think you've seen it all, you haven't." And then there are some screenshots on the back of the box, and I've got to say, yep, this one sells me 150 million% because it looks absolutely awesome. It sounds absolutely awesome. The screenshots look impeccably designed with an art style that I simply love. There is a reason why I bought this back when it came out originally. There's a reason why I would want to buy this again if I were to see it on a store shelf, if they actually sold this on a store shelf. It is simply a classic design. It tells you everything you need to know about the game without telling you really anything about the game, because the game is full of secrets that you will only uncover by playing the game. But yes, this box absolutely does it for me, and it is one that I think everyone should have on their shelf. We're going to move on and start talking about the more specific aspects of the game now, and we're going to start by talking about the graphics. The graphics in Symphony of the Night are truly spectacular, with a pixel and sprite art style that represents some of the best looking visuals to ever grace a classic title. Seriously, the art design for the game is almost unmatched, and you can see the quality of the visuals in every aspect of the game's main presentation, from the environmental backgrounds and the multiple levels of parallax scrolling that serve to add depth to each and every scene, to the primary foreground objects that all display incredible amounts of detail and handcrafted imagery, to the enemies you encounter, all of whom look distinct, even if some may be varying types of one standard base model. And of course, the character model for Alucard himself, where every equipment change and action you take is represented on the screen with an artistic, almost painterly flair. At one point in my playthrough, I became enthralled watching Alucard's cape flutter in the breeze as I ran back and forth across one of the rooms in the castle, and I simply thought to myself, this is superb. The game looks so good that if you paused the action, took a screenshot, and then had it printed on a canvas, you could hang it on a wall in your house. That's how good Symphony of the Night looks. The same care and attention to detail was used when creating the various animations for every creature and object in the game, all of whom move with a degree of fluidity that not many other titles of the time can match, which helps the game not only look amazing, but also allows for a degree of control responsiveness that is impressively snappy. We'll talk more about the controls later on, but from a visual perspective, suffice it to say, Symphony of the Night looks gorgeous. The only area that falls a bit short from my perspective are the pre-rendered cutscenes that play at certain points throughout the game. Those cutscenes are pretty darn low quality, and the compression on the video makes it so that the level of visual fidelity is dramatically lower than the rest of the game, which makes them feel out of place given just how good everything else looks. This isn't enough to lower my opinion of the game in the slightest, but it is something that warrants mentioning, if only to ensure a complete and accurate discussion of the game's visual environment. Moving on to the sound and music, if Symphony of the Night's graphics are gorgeous, its music is simply divine, with a wide variety of musical styles that perfectly match the environments you'll be exploring and the action taking place on the screen. I legitimately love every ounce of music in the game, and there are several songs included here that are some of my favorite video game songs of all time, with perhaps my favorite out of the entire game being the musical piece that plays while exploring the library. When that harpsichord starts playing, coupled with the strings, and they all come together into a gothic Baroque-esque classical performance, oh my god, it's so good. I have loved that song ever since I played Symphony of the Night when it first came out, and I don't think there will ever be a moment that I don't love that song. The fact that there are other songs throughout the game that are almost as good as that one is just crazy to me, because this entire soundtrack is just, there are no words. I don't give this level of praise lightly, but Symphony of the Night might have one of the best soundtracks ever created. It is simply that good. Sound effects, meanwhile, all have the appropriate level of polish and punch, all of which serve to enhance the feeling of playing the game. And finally, the voice acting. Oh my, the voice acting. We need to talk about the voice acting. First of all, it bears mentioning that the voice acting in the original Symphony of the Night is different than that included in the PSP and later versions, as Konami decided to make some tweaks to both the script and the voice work to make it sound a bit less like a high school production of Bram Stoker's Dracula, which from my perspective is both a good thing as well as a shame. Because from a purely technical voice work perspective, the PSP and later versions all sound more professional than the PS1 version, which serves to make the game's auditory presentation even better. But you do lose some of the charm of the original by getting rid of the Resident Evil styled over-the-top wooden mannequin reading lines approach that was prevalent throughout the game. From my perspective, either version, either the original's corny acting or the revised version's slightly less corny acting, are both perfect, and I have no complaints. Sure, if you're expecting quote-unquote real acting, you're not going to find that here, but I could not care less. This is the right kind of campy dialogue and corny acting, and I love it. There is not a single piece of the auditory environment that isn't amazing. I legitimately have zero complaints. Moving on to the narrative and story, you play as Alucard, the son of vampire legend Dracula, and you're on a mission to assault your father's castle and defeat his evil plans, once and for all. This, as you might imagine, will involve a whole lot of killing, exploring, and platforming, as Dracula's castle is not just gigantic, but it also houses a huge number of evil monsters and creatures with one goal in mind: destroying you. Along the way, you'll encounter several other individuals who are all seemingly want to assist you with taking down the evil lord of the castle, along with one former vampire hunter who has seemingly fallen to the dark side. It's up to you to conquer the denizens of the castle, help your allies, and defeat Dracula before he can unleash his evil upon the world. The story in Symphony of the Night is perfect within the context of the game, in that it offers just enough lore and backstory to give you a reason for playing the game, while not being overbearing or distracting you from the core focus of the title, which is the amazing gameplay, world, and overall ambiance. I appreciated the story that was included, and I especially liked the clues that were included to suggest that there's more to this castle than what you might otherwise assume. There's not a heck of a lot of dialogue or plot here, but honestly, that's 100% fine. What is here works well, and what isn't can be filled in by your imagination as you jump, fight, and explore your way through Dracula's castle. I have no narrative complaints. Moving on to the playability and controls, the controls for Symphony of the Night feel exceedingly modern, despite its overall age, which is likely due to the fact that the overall style of the game, that being a two-dimensional platform action kind of experience, was well understood, even back in 1997, so it avoids some of the pitfalls that many PlayStation 1 games fall into, with their early 3D visuals and experimental control schemes that may, or may not, end up working. Symphony of the Night is pure two-dimensional goodness, and you can tell that the team that made the game understood how to create a high-quality 2D action platforming experience. Moving around the environment is accomplished using your directional pad, as you might expect, with your X button allowing you to jump, your square and circle buttons using the items in your left and right hand respectively, which for me was usually some sort of weapon paired with a shield, and the triangle button performing a backwards dash that you can potentially use to help avoid certain attacks. Your shoulder buttons, meanwhile, allow you to shapeshift into either a wolf, a bat, or a cloud of mist, assuming you found those specific relics, and the start button brings you to your inventory and character management page, where you can equip different items, explore your stats, and manage any relics and familiars you may have acquired. Nearly everything about these controls are well designed and feel like they were ripped right out of a modern title, which means playing Symphony of the Night today feels as good as playing any other masterpiece Metroidvania that may have released in the last 30 years. The menu-driven equipment and inventory interface is the only piece that you could argue has aged a little bit, but even with that, it feels perfectly fine to use in practice. It just looks and feels a bit older than the rest of the game. As I've already talked about, playing the game is simply a joy, and as I sit here reflecting on my most recent playthrough, I am finding it hard to come up with anything in terms of critique to levy against the game. Symphony of the Night is so darn good that it avoids most of the normal criticisms that you might apply to a game from the later 90s, which is likely one of the reasons that the game has remained a beloved classic ever since it was released. That said, if I were to nitpick, there are a couple areas that might have been smoothed out just a little bit. For one, all of the action following the midway point of the game, which I won't spoil, but if you know, you know, all of that content is dramatically more challenging than the first half of the game, so much so that it'll feel like you just accidentally set the difficulty to hard mode after playing the rest of the game on easy. The damage that later game enemies do, coupled with their movement mechanics and increased health pools, make it so that many enemies in the second half of the game are incredibly deadly, and if you've been playing kinda loosely in your gameplay up to that point, you're going to have to start paying attention pretty quickly, lest you end up dying repeatedly. All of the enemies in the game can be countered, and careful observation will give you the information you need to emerge victorious, but compared to the first half of the game, the second half is a gigantic leap in difficulty. There are also several bosses in the second half of the game that, from my perspective, are tuned to be a bit too challenging in comparison to the rest of the bosses in the game. You all know I do not shy away from a challenge, and I don't mind difficult encounters at all. In fact, I usually enjoy them. But I do have a slight issue with difficulty spikes, as opposed to gradual difficulty ramp up, and there are definitely a few gut check bosses here in the later portions of the game that feel like a bit too big of a leap over the other bosses that preceded them, and even a good chunk of the bosses that follow them. It's not a huge deal, but it is something I noticed. Otherwise, and I mean this truthfully, there's really not much else I can say about the game from a critical perspective. This is one of those rare games that does almost everything right, and I simply love it. It's truly as close to a perfect game as you're going to find in every respect. There's legitimately nothing more to be said. So, what is our verdict on Castlevania Symphony of the Night? Well, it should come as no surprise, but Symphony of the Night has just become the newest member of our pantheon of classic gaming, and even beyond that distinction, is one of those rare gems that likely belongs on the much more selective Mount Rushmore of video game history. It is the kind of title that transcends its genre and the time it was created in to become something even greater. A truly timeless classic in every sense of the word, and as such is undoubtedly deserving of its spot in our pantheon of classic gaming. That was our episode on Castlevania Symphony of the Night. I hope you all enjoyed listening to it as much as I enjoyed creating it. If you'd like to reach out, let me know how I'm doing, provide feedback, comments, suggestions, or just talk about classic games and technology in general, I would love to hear from you, and there are a few ways you can reach out. I have an X account with the handle @ClassicGamingT. I have an email address, which is classicgamingtoday@gmail.com, and we have our Discord server. The link is in the show notes. Discord is the best way to get in touch with me and the rest of the community around this podcast. We have a ton of fun out on Discord. I highly encourage you all to check it out. I also highly encourage you to check out our Patreon. It is patreon.com/ClassicGamingToday. If you want even more Classic Gaming Today goodness, including a Patreon exclusive bi-weekly podcast expansion pack, patreon.com/ClassicGamingToday is where it's at. Before we sign off for the week, I do want to mention that our next episode is going to be focused on Dynasty Warriors 2, so feel free to write in if you have any particularly fond or not so fond memories of that experience. At the same time, I recognize you're likely listening to this podcast on any number of podcast services, and if you would feel so inclined, it would be great if you could leave me a review. This is not about bolstering star counts. This is not about trying to harvest a ton of 5-star ratings, though if that happens, awesome, it means we're doing something right. No, what it's really all about is trying to deliver the best possible podcast I can. The only way to do that is to get feedback from all of you, the listener community, to make sure I'm hitting the mark and delivering the content you all want to listen to. We get new listeners every single day, which is simply amazing. I want to continue to grow this community and continue to make the best possible podcast I can. We'll be back in around a week with our next episode focused on Dynasty Warriors 2. Until then, remember, sometimes the games of the past are just as good, if not better, than the games of today. Goodbye, everyone.